The styles of the owl and nightingale and aconine rival show that around the year 1200 both poetry and prose were being written for sophisticated and well-educated readers whose primary language was English. Throughout the 13th and early 14th century, there are many kinds of evidence that although French continued to be principal language of parliament, law, business, and high culture, English was gaining ground. Several authors of religious and didactic works in English state that they are writing for the benefit of those who don't understand Latin or French. Anthologies were made of miscellaneous works adapted from French for English readers and original pieces in English. Most of the nobility were by now bilingual, and the author of an English romance written early in the 14th century declares that he has seen many nobles who cannot speak English, French. Children of the nobility and the merchant class are now learning French as a second language. By the 1360s, the linguistic, political, and cultural climate had been prepared for the flowering of Middle English literature in the writings of Chaucer, Gower, Langland, and the Gawain poets. The 14th century, war and disease were prevalent throughout the Middle Ages, but never more devastatingly than during the 14th century. In the wars against France, the gains of two spectacular English victories at Crecy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 were gradually frittered away in futile campaigns that ravaged the French countryside without obtaining any clear advantage for English. In 1348, the first and most virulent epidemic of the bubonic plague, the Black Death swept Europe, wiping out a quarter to a third of the population. The toll was higher in crowded urban centers. Giovanni Boccaccio's description of the plague in Florence, with which he introduces the Decameron, vividly portrays its ravages. So many corpses were would arrive in front of a church every day and at every hour that the amount of holy ground for burials was certainly insufficient for the ancient custom of giving each body its individual place. When all the graves were full, huge trenches and dug in all the cemeteries of the churches, and into them the new arrivals were dumped by hundreds, and they were packed in three there with dirt, one on top of another, like a ship's cargo, until the trench were filled. The resulting scarcity of labor and a sudden expansion of the possibilities for social mobility and fostered popular discontent. In 1381, attempts to enforce vague controls and to collect oppressive new taxes provoked a rural uprising in Essex and Kent that dealt a profound shock to the English ruling class. The participants were, for the most part, tenant farmers, day laborers, apprentices, and rural workers not attached to the big manors. A few of the lower clergy sided with the rebels against their wealthy church superiors. The priest Johann Ball was among the leaders. The movement was quickly suppressed, but not before sympathizers in London had admitted the rebels through two city gates which had been barred against them. The The insurgents burned down the palace of the hated Duke of Lancaster, and they summarily beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury and the treasurers of England who had taken refuge in the Tower of London. The church had become the target of popular resentment because it was among the greatest of oppressive landowners and because of wealth, worldliness, and venality of many of the higher clergy. These calamities and upheavals nevertheless did not stem the growth of international trade and the influence of merchant class. The portrait of Geoffrey Chaucer's merchant, we see the budding of capitalism based on credit and interest. Cities like London ran their own affairs under politically powerful mayors and aldermen. Edward III, chronically in need of money to finance his wars, was obliged to negotiate for revenues with the Commons in the English Parliament, an institution that became a major political force during this period. A large part of the king's revenue depended on the taxing the profitable export of English wool to the continent. The crown thus became involved in the country's economic affairs, and this involvement led to a need for capable administrators. These were no longer drawn mainly from the church as in the past, but from a newly educated laity that occupied a rank somewhere between that of lesser nobility and the upper bourgeoisie. The career of Chaucer, who served Edward III and his successors Richard II in a number of civil posts, is typical of this class, with the exception that Chaucer was also a great poet. In 14th century, a few poets and intellectuals achieved the status and respect formerly accorded only to the ancients. Marie de France and Cretin de Troyes had dedicated their works to noble patrons and in their role as narrators addressed themselves as entertainers and sometimes as instructors to court audiences. Dantes, who was born in 1265 and was died in 1321, made himself the protagonist of the Divine Comedy, the second poem as he called it, in which he revealed the secrets of the afterlife. After his death, manuscripts of the work were provided with lengthy commentaries as though it were scripture, scripture, and public readings and lectures were devoted to it. Francis Petrarch, who was born in 1304 and who was died in 1374, won an international reputation as a man of letters. He wrote primarily in Latin and contrived to have himself crowned poet laureate in emulation of the Roman poets whose works he imitated, but his most famous work is the sonnet sequence he wrote in Italian. Giovanni Boccaccio, who was born in 1313 and was died in 1375, was among Petrarch's most ardent admirers and carried a literary correspondence with him. Chaucer read these authors along with the ancient Roman poets and drew on them in his own works. The Chaucer's Clerk's Tale is based on a Latin version Petrarch made from the last tale in the Boccaccio's Decameron. In his prologue, the clerk refers to Petrarch as laureate poets, whose sweet rhetoric illuminated all Italy with his poetry, yet in his own time the English poet Chaucer never attained the kind of laurels that he and others are accorded to Petrarch. In his earlier works, Chaucer portrayed himself comically as a diligent reader of old books, as an aspiring apprentice writer, and as an eager spectator on the brink of a fashionable world of courtiers and birds. In the House of Fame, he relates a dream of being snatched up by a huge golden eagle. The eagle and many other things in his works were inspired by Dante, who transports in him to the palace of the goddess Fame. There he gets to see phantoms like the shades in Dante's poem. Of all the famous authors of antiquity, at the end of his romance, Troilus and Cresside, Chaucer asked his little book to kiss the footsteps where the great ancient poets had passed before. Like Dante and Petrarch, Chaucer had an ideal of great poetry, and in his Troilus at least strove to emulate it. But in the title of House of Fame and in his final work, The Canterbury Tales, he also views that ideal ironically and distances himself from it. The many surviving documents that record Geoffrey Chaucer's career as a civil servant don't contain a single word to show that he was also a poet. Only in the following centuries would be canonized as the father of English poetry.